lights in a night, what's broken? Feel the pulse, feel the rush, no token. Sirens cry in the city's old heart, chasing shadows from the start. Ambulance roll on through the haze, sound of mercy and a last grace. Pounding voices, ain't no second show, speeding fast through the streets below.
Welcome to episode number 6 of Yucaipa 360. Today we are talking about ambulance service here in the city of Yucaipa and throughout the county of San Bernardino. Many residents have noticed a large number of different looking ambulances parked at the building that used to be a business incubator center here run by the city, and before that served as the city's police station. And that has generated some questions here at City Hall and some conversations online. So we thought it might be helpful to discuss for the community how ambulance services are provided here in Yucaipa and countywide, and to explain the pending shift from those services being provided by AMR to being provided by CONFIRE. And in a minute, we'll talk about what CONFIRE is. But to help us do that, we have with us today Chief Nathan Cooke, who is interim director of CONFIRE, also deputy chief with Chino Valley Fire District. Chief, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. We also have Chief Grant Malinowski. By rank, Chief Malinowski is a battalion chief with CAL FIRE, but serves as our fire chief here in the city of Yucaipa. Chief Malinowski, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So CONFIRE is a joint powers authority, or JPA, comprised of 15 member agencies throughout the county of San Bernardino. And a joint powers authority, or JPA, is an organization, a separate legal entity that is comprised of multiple government agencies, right? So CONFIRE, those 15 member agencies, one of them is the city of Yucaipa. Chief Cooke, if you could maybe just give us a history of CONFIRE and what services it has provided and what services it's planning to provide.
Sure, appreciate that. So CONFIRE, or AKA Consolidated Fire Agencies, were affectionately known as CONFIRE here in the county and throughout the region. Back in the 1970s, when the 911 dispatch center started to come online, and there was a push to move just not from law enforcement centric 911 dispatch centers, but also to include the fire service and the emergency medical services. And so when that came to be, a number of the fire chiefs here locally in the region got together and they said, hey, instead of our own cities or fire departments having our own individual 911 dispatch centers, why don't we combine services? And so they came up with this concept of, economies of scale, if you will. And so instead of having 4 or 5 different 911 dispatch centers throughout those communities, they joined forces and they had one. And the idea was born of Consolidated Fire Agencies. And it wasn't until 1990 that we actually became known as Consolidated Fire Agencies formally through that JPA agreement. And so, as mentioned before, we have 15 agencies, 9 member agencies, which are owner agencies, and the remainder are contract agencies. And so our primary mission is to provide 911 secondary call center answering for 911 services, fire, rescue, and EMS services.
Okay, great. So just so people are aware, in the county of San Bernardino, there is the San Bernardino County Fire Protection District, right, which is countywide and provides fire services, kind of like a JPA. The Fire Protection District is a separate legal entity. Their board is the County Board of Supervisors, right? But actually, the city of Yucaipa is not part of the County Fire Protection District. The city of Yucaipa is one of 2 cities in San Bernardino County that contracts directly with CAL FIRE for fire service. And so Yucaipa, it has not historically been a member of CONFIRE for the purposes of dispatch, right? So Chief Malinowski, maybe talk to us a little bit about in Yucaipa how dispatch works, since we're not part of CONFIRE for that purpose.
Correct. So with CAL FIRE, we are a total package. It's a all-inclusive contract for service. So we are still the Yucaipa Fire Department, Yucaipa Fire Stations, Yucaipa Fire Engines. We ask CAL FIRE for that staffing. And with that staffing comes big brother essentially. So we get dispatch services, investigation services, law enforcement, heavy equipment services, training, payroll, union negotiations, stuff like that. So the city can say, please give us a fire department staffing and support, and that's what CAL FIRE does for us. So there was never a need to pay an additional dispatching fee to CONFIRE.
Okay, so the other city that contracts directly with CAL FIRE in San Bernardino County is the city of Highland, who is
Correct.
Our neighbor. So Yucaipa and Highland are working with CAL FIRE. How does CAL FIRE and CONFIRE operate to coordinate services? And because we're all neighbors here in the county, we operate in the same areas of the county. How does that communication across those lines work?
So I think we need to look back at what drove that, and that was EMS response. So EMS response, it gets our frontline paramedics, which is our paramedics on the fire engine for Yucaipa Fire, and then we also need transport paramedics. And if it's a critical call, we need both. So critical calls need more than one paramedic. And we had an issue where we couldn't get transport paramedics. Severely delayed ambulances, patients going to the hospital in fire engines. We need to change the fire chiefs. And it wasn't just us. We were, and Chino, so Chief Cooke's department, were the taking the brunt of the worst of it. So the fire chiefs told the county, hey, we need to come together. We need to have better transportation services. Hence the RFP to provide a new EMS contract, which geared us towards going to CONFIRE. So CONFIRE, hey, what if we provide this ambulance service that we know the right thing for the public, which will make it better, ensure life safety services, and we can provide that if we all come together like Chief Cooke talked about. Let's all get together and do the right thing. So within CONFIRE, I don't want to speak for them, but there's the dispatch services and there's EMS services, which is what we came together. Absolutely, let's do that. Okay. We can provide the ultimate product for our citizens.
So the shift to CONFIRE for the EMS services and Yucaipa's involvement in that will not impact where we get our dispatch currently.
No, not at all. Okay. Unrelated.
Let's back up a little bit, because I think the average resident, the average citizen, doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about how the provision of EMS works, right? We get a lot of comments here about, well, I don't. Why did the fire engine show up? I fell down, or I had a heart attack, and I needed an ambulance. Why did the fire engine show up? And a lot of people don't realize that the way it's set up here in San Bernardino County, which is the way it's set up in Riverside County and many other places in California, is that the first responder is designated as that fire engine, right? The firefighters and the paramedics that show up on that fire engine. The ambulance is not the first responder. The ambulance service is transport to the hospital, correct? So the way the system is designed is that when you call 911 and you're having a medical emergency, the fire engine shows up with a paramedic on that engine to provide that life-saving service. An ambulance then shows up and the patient is stabilized and transferred to the ambulance, which also has a paramedic on it, at least. That's the idea, right? And then that ambulance transports the patient to the hospital. A lot of people think that the first responder is the ambulance. I'm having a medical emergency, so I need an ambulance. Well, no, here in Yucaipa and throughout California, what you need is that paramedic on the fire engine, and then when you're stable enough to be transported, you're transported by the ambulance.
Yeah, and I don't want to not call them first responders. They have that ability.
Correct.
But it goes back to standards of coverage. So when you have a county standard that says 90% of the time we'll have an ambulance there in 10 minutes, but you need paramedics in 4 minutes, yes, your first responders are those fire engines that are typically available by what we staff to get there and save that life before the ambulance typically would show up. And it's just a numbers game.
Right. You touched on something that I want to delve into a little bit more, and that is when the ambulance shows up, that ambulance is supposed to have a paramedic on it.
Correct.
And what was happening in San Bernardino County, and I can tell you also in Riverside County, because prior to being here in Yucaipa, I was managing the city of Canyon Lake in Riverside County, is that ambulances would show up oftentimes without a paramedic on that ambulance. So they were incapable of providing advanced life support. they could provide basic life support. But if you're having a serious health issue like a heart attack, they were unable to help, right? And I think this started around the time of COVID. At least in Riverside County, from my point of view, that's when the problem first became noticeable. And people are having trouble staffing. A lot of people quit. And AMR, who is the provider in Riverside County, who has also been the provider here in San Bernardino County, was reporting that they were unable to get staffing levels where they needed them, right? And so what would happen often is ambulances would be very late, sometimes not show up at all, oftentimes show up but without a paramedic on them. And when that happens, the paramedic on the fire engine has to stay with that patient and either ride with that patient in the ambulance, or in some cases, patients have even been transported on fire engines to hospitals, which is shocking. And then that fire engine is without that paramedic, and so that engine is taken out of service. In the city of Canyon Lake, we had one fire station with one engine assigned to the whole city. That's a real problem. Even here in Yucaipa, we have 3 fire stations. We have 3 fire engines on at any one time. To take one out of service is a big problem. I mean, these are life and death situations we're talking about, and that needed to be corrected. And so I think that's, and you can speak to this much more in a much more knowledgeable way than I can, but from my perspective, that is what caused a lot of cities to say something has to change.
Absolutely. And it's not was happening, it is happening still. So we're still getting daily EMT ambulances, correct. So our frontline paramedics, even if it's not a critical call, are subsidizing the transportation services. So we're pulling a fire engine out of service to go to the emergency room, and we're stripping the city. So it was unsustainable for us, and it still is, which is why I looked for a better option, and that was CONFIRE.
Right.
I think it's also important to understand the deployment model in the county of San Bernardino that's been set by the county itself. And ultimately what you have is the system was designed with a ALS, advanced life support system in mind, meaning paramedics, right? So when the system was created and crafted, there were a couple different deployment models that the county could have went with and actually went with. And that's what the chief was talking about here is every ambulance in the county of San Bernardino is required to have 1 paramedic and 1 EMT. And that's what makes it an advanced life support unit. And with that 90% of the time, that was relying on your local fire agencies to then also be equipped with advanced life support paramedics on those fire engines to then create a situation where every call has a minimum of 2 paramedics. And so the first responders, the folks that are in the fire service and those that are strategically located in their communities and the fire stations because they can get to those calls quicker, that was the whole impetus of that deployment system and that model. Well, once that model breaks down, well, then you have these domino effects, right? So now you have service degradation, you have fire units that are being pulled out of service to go follow up on maybe a low acuity call where that's not needed. You have ambulances that are out of position. You know, if this fire engine has to go out of their district to go handle that call because now they need a paramedic, right? It just creates all kinds of confusion and chaos for the system, which then down the line, a whole bunch of folks are being negatively impacted. And so it's important to understand the deployment model that the counties went with. And so CONFIRE and all the fire agencies and all the cities recognize we got to do something different. And so when the county actually went out to bid for this ambulance system, which by the way, this has never happened in the county's history in the 40 plus years that we've been around here in the county providing this type of service, it's never gone out to competitive bid for the ambulance services here in the county. And so we're so thankful that the Board of Supervisors recognized the need to put it out to competitive bid. And that's where CONFIRE and frankly, the fire agencies and all the communities got together and said, what would be the best vehicle to make this happen? And that's when CONFIRE came on the scene to say, hey, we're already doing that from a communication standpoint. As an operational area coordinator, we work with CAL FIRE, the Forest Service, all of our allied agencies. Ontario Fire has a dispatch center, Barstow has a dispatch center. And so CONFIRE kind of being the brain in the operational area coordinator, it made sense to use CONFIRE as that vehicle. And our agencies are already doing that. We've got a number of agencies in the county that already transport with ambulances, Rialto Fire, County Fire, a host of other agencies are providing those types of services. So it absolutely made sense to have everything co-located and have everything in alignment for the first time in the county's history.
And I want to talk in a minute a little bit more about that process, that competitive bid process. But you said something I think is important too. A lot of residents believe that ambulance service is provided by the city. And when, their insurance gets billed for that service, a lot of times they contact the city on those issues. I would love for the city of Yucaipa to be able to run our own ambulance service. I mean, that would be something that would be a great service for our residents, but it would also be, we don't like to talk in terms of revenue generation as a city, but it would produce revenue that could then offset our costs for, our fire service in general, right? Many years ago, there was it the California EMS Act that defined who had the authority to run ambulance service. And while some cities who were already running ambulance service at that time were grandfathered in, which is why you still see some cities that do have the ability and do run their own ambulance service, the vast majority of cities in California no longer have that right, and it's called 201 rights, right? Yucaipa does not have 201 rights. We don't have the legal ability to say, you know what, we're gonna start providing this service in-house. Maybe if you guys could explain how that works in most places in California, in San Bernardino County, where we have this agency that's in charge of EMS and how that is set up.
Yeah, so we have everything works under exclusive operating areas, which is defined by the county as well as ISMA. That's the EMS agency that oversees EMS services in the county. And to ensure all citizens, so from a very populous area to a non-populous area, receive the same services, they have to kind of lump them together into an exclusive operating area, because who's going to want to bid on the non-money maker? They're only going to bid on the money maker.
Right.
So the county has that statutory authority because we don't have the 201 rights. They do, with the exceptions, like you said, like Rialto Fire, Running Springs, San Bernardino County Fire in some areas. And they're going to hold that so they can ensure that all areas are provided a service.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really affectionately what the EMS Act did. And it's under the Health and Safety Code 1797-201 if you want to get geeked out about it. And basically what it says, and it's an interesting statute in the Health and Safety Code, probably one of the only ones on the book that has a date. So if you were not providing ground ambulance transport services prior to July 1st of 1980, then you couldn't do it, and it would default back to the county that had jurisdiction. And so in this case, as the chief was mentioning, that would be the county of San Bernardino, and ISMA, which is our local LIMSA authority. They're the ones that have that authority. So then they have to figure out, how are we going to provide those services equitably across the entire county for those communities that don't have their 201 rights. And so that's how we got here back in 1980, July 1st, that went into effect. And so what happened was all these EOAs, exclusive operating areas, were put together and they were put in place. And back then you had a lot of smaller ambulance companies that were all merged together with the current incumbent provider. And so that's why they've had this contract really since that date and time. And so that's an important piece to note for our community members to go, even if you wanted to have control over that, ultimately the county has to discharge that responsibility. And so the way they do it as a government entity is they go out to competitive bid. And so that's kind of what it led us down to this road to have this conversation today, is that's what the county of San Bernardino did. They said, hey, we feel that it's the right time to go out to competitive bid, to see what is out there, to see what's different, and, to try to change the EMS system as we know it. And so that's ultimately how we ended up here. But it's an important piece for people to understand that local communities don't have control over that if you don't have your 201 rights, and it defaults back to the county.
Right.
One interesting note to that too, just related, unrelated. So we've had 201 ALS non-transport rights that we actually had to go and justify to the state a couple of years ago. Just a historical fact, Yucaipa Valley, since before the city's incorporation, we've had one of the first paramedic programs in the county dating back to 1976. So we had full-time paramedics here in the here with CALFIRE, CDF at the time, back in the late 70s. So we had to justify to the state that we have 201 ALS non-transport rights here just because of agreements with ISM and stuff. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of residents are under the impression that the city runs the service and the city gets revenue from the service. That's unfortunately not the case, and it's not the case for most cities in California. But kind of a growing trend, because costs have increased so much for fire service and EMS. A lot of cities are going to EMS billing, and then sometimes EMS subscription. Right. The idea being that the service the city is providing is separate from the ambulance. It's that firefighter paramedic that arrives on the fire engine. That's the EMS service, and then the ambulance transport is something separate that the city is not providing. Interesting, when a city incorporates, when people in a certain area decide we don't want to be with the county anymore, we want to incorporate and be a city, there are certain responsibilities that legally this new city has to provide to its residents. Police service is one, fire service is another. Interestingly, EMS is not on that list, right? And so some cities say, well, we can't afford to provide that service, right? Or we can't provide it for free. So, that's going to have to become a fee for service. If you want that service, there has to be a fee associated with it. And so they start billing. And this is something the City of Yucaipa has looked at in the past and actually got the green light from the City Council to begin, although they phrased it compassionate billing, right? Which meant we're only going to bill insurance companies that will pay. We're not going to bill residents directly. But, the idea being that, look, the property taxes that we all pay for fire service, those were designed for fire suppression. Mm-hmm. That was in a time before fire departments started providing paramedic service, right? And now that paramedic service provided by these fire departments, fire agencies, has become such a large part of what the job entails that, in Yucaipa and in most other cities, that's pretty close to 80% of the total number of calls that are gone on, right? So the funding streams that were put into place never anticipated that. And so now how do we pay for that, right? So people say, well, my property taxes already pay for that. Well, not really. Your property taxes were designed to pay for fire suppression. So if you want the service, now we're going to have to start invoicing that, and some cities say, but we're going to offer this subscription service. So, if you decide to subscribe for this low annual fee, that doesn't matter how many times you call 911 for EMS service, you're never gonna get an invoice. And it's something this city has looked at as costs have continued to rise. But I think it's important for people to understand the delineation between those services provided by the city on the fire engine versus the ambulance component.
Yeah, and I'll take that one. I think, when you look at the county of San Bernardino and the fee for service for the ambulances, that's all regulated by the county. And so when somebody receives an invoice or a bill for those services that were provided, that was all approved and regulated by the county of San Bernardino. And so it's the ISMA board of directors. They get together and they set that fee for service based on the level of acuity and what the paramedics did and what the ambulance provided. And so that's an important piece. To your point, it's not coming off the general fund from the cities. The cities aren't making those bills. They're not making those regulations. That comes directly from the county of San Bernardino. And of course, what they'll do is with a provider like CONFIRE or the current incumbent provider, they're going to go to us and say, hey, what are your costs, right, to provide those services? And so the big piece that I think I would love for the public to understand as well is that at the end of the day, to have that paramedic and that EMT, to transport and have them on standby for those 911 calls, there's a cost of doing that business. And so what we've done collectively as CONFIRE is we've worked with the county to figure out what that is going to look like so that we can ensure that everyone's being provided the service equitably across the board. And it's the same fee across the board for the entire county of San Bernardino. And again, you had mentioned it earlier, that's going primarily to the insurance companies. And so, when you have insurance and you have health insurance, it's going to say right in your policy, when there's an emergency and there's an ambulance transport, the insurance company is going to cover X amount. And so the other piece of it is a lot of our folks are on some type of subsidy, right? So if that's Medi-Cal or Medicare, in a lot of cases here in this county of San Bernardino, IEHP, there's that fee for service that occurs as well. Well, Medi-Cal and Medicare only pays a certain percentage of that ambulance transport no matter what. So if a bill, was $1,500, Medi-Cal or Medicare would say, we're only going to, cover $200 of that. And so in order to make up for the difference, that's why you'll see you got to take the entire ecosystem into consideration when you're setting those rates. And again, those are set by the County of San Bernardino.
So I want to go back and talk about the process of how we got to where we are today. So in December of last year, there was a Board of Supervisors meeting. I was in attendance of that meeting. Representatives from most cities in the county were in that room or in one of the overflow rooms. And what was really striking to me was how unified every city in the county was on this issue. I don't know that I've ever seen another issue where, you had city managers, fire chiefs, elected officials from almost every city in the county there on the same side of an issue, right? And that was the meeting where the Board of Supervisors took up the awarding of this EMS contract. Walk me through what led up to that day.
Yeah, I think ultimately, the chief had mentioned it earlier and you talked about it, at the end of the day, the services that had been provided previously in the county hadn't changed for 40 years, frankly, and it's been the same deployment model. It's been the same service. And so I think what we felt as public safety and public servants, all of the communities that we represent, we knew we needed to do something different. We felt like the system that was in place wasn't working any longer. It wasn't up to the 2024 standards, if you will. It wasn't innovative. It was really, really, really stagnant. And so I think once we got together and we realized that, and look, when you have this many communities come together, so not only are we 15 fire agencies or communities and cities and districts, you think about it, we've got 30 some odd towns and cities that are represented by CONFIRE with the County of San Bernardino Fire District, right? So they represent 52% of CONFIRE. And so as we started getting feedback from our stakeholders, we started talking to the hospitals, we started talking to our law enforcement partners, we were talking to our community members, our elected officials. It was glaringly obvious to us that we needed some type of change and we needed to have some type of economies of scale. And so we mentioned earlier about this, cost for service. Well, if you think about it, if all of those revenues that are being made on the ambulance side are leaving the county and going sometimes in some instances overseas to shareholders, how does that benefit the local community? And so if we can provide a service and develop a deployment model where it's a public-private partnership and the public controls the system, and we already have the operational area coordination piece, we have the dispatch centers that are linked up, we're already doing that now. Well, let's bring the ambulance. By the way, the private ambulance providers, they're not linked up with us. They are not in our 911 dispatch centers. We don't have common communications with them. We don't even know where they're at. And so that's a big, big problem. So if you're tasked with, providing public safety for your communities, you got to change that. Well, CONFIRE is the vehicle for that. It's already established. It's proven. It's been there, like I said, since the late 1970s. And so it was pretty obvious and a seamless transition to go, okay, let's do something better. And through this public-private partnership, we've now allowed fire agencies and cities and districts that wanted to transport to be able to transport to help offset that. And so that we've got a bigger workforce, we've got surge capacity. And so I know in Yucaipa, as an example, there'll be a surge ambulance that will be placed here. So in the event that we can't get an ambulance from, the current provider, well, then we have a surge. And so we can put that ambulance in service on the fly and get that patient to the hospital quickly. So to us, it was a no-brainer. And listening, we did a lot of listening sessions to find out what the issues were with our stakeholders. And we put that together and gave our proposal, and there was overwhelming community support, as you mentioned.
When the item came to the board in December of last year, the decision was between CONFIRE and the current service provider, AMR. Was it that way from the beginning of the process, or were there initially other applicants that were interested as well?
There was several applicants that showed up to the, what was it called? The
Bidders Conference, right?
Conference, yeah. And then at the end, there was only really two companies that could facilitate the bid, and that was CONFIRE and AMR.
I don't know if you can speak to this, but years ago I worked for the Board of Supervisors, and at that time, the County Fire Protection District had been pushing hard for the fire district itself to be given an opportunity to bid on providing ambulance service. Why why the shift in thinking there? I was kind of surprised that the county fire protection district itself wasn't an applicant, but instead decided to partner and be part of CONFIRE.
So I think kind of what's the motivation? What was the motivation for Yucaipa to join CONFIRE? So we were tired of being at somebody else's mercy. We were tired of pleading with the ambulance company to provide our citizens a service they deserve and should have, and it falling upon deaf ears. So how do we do that? How do we change that? We become a stakeholder. So with CONFIRE, we are a stakeholder. So I would be leery here of giving somebody else that control where we're still at their behest to do the right thing, whereas with CONFIRE, we have a voice, we have a vote, and we're a stakeholder in that. So we are CONFIRE, we are providing that service, obviously as a portion of the conglomerate, but it's us.
Yeah, and I think the big piece, there's been a number of leadership changes over at County Fire, and certainly thankful for the previous leadership and certainly the leadership that's in place now. And, they've always been CONFIRE, right? So like I mentioned, they're over 50% of CONFIRE. And so when you look at the makeup of CONFIRE, it makes sense to have that stakeholder involvement and to have all of us together as opposed to just one entity doing it. And I think previously that was kind of the way it was looked at as, County Fire was going to come in and provide that service. And we know they would have done a great job, but if you're one of those agencies that are not county fire, you have your own fire department, you have your own community that you're worried about fire protection for. Well, what's your voice, right? And so how do you become a part of that? Well, that's what CONFIRE offers. So the city of Yucaipa, Chief Malinowski, has a seat at the table. You have a seat at the table as a city manager, right, to be able to influence and speak into what that deployment model looks like.
Right.
One thing that came out of this too, that is regardless of what occurs in the future, is the cohesiveness and collaboration between all the departments. One good thing, a lot of good things came, was CAD to CAD too. So before, you have CONFIRE Dispatch Center, you have Ontario Fire Dispatch Center, you have CAL FIRE, and we do more dispatch contracts than just the cities. The cities are the two all risk contracts. But now they're seamlessly put together through CAD to CAD. That means all the computers talk to each other, essentially, not to dumb it down, but you're sitting next to me, or you're sitting 400 miles from me, and we're all seeing the same thing. And before, it was kind of held tight to the vest on, ours versus yours versus theirs. And now, essentially county-wide, we're all having that transparency on closest resource concept and helping each other out. So that's a huge win.
Maybe for those who are watching and listening who aren't familiar, maybe explain CAD.
Yeah, so computer-aided dispatch, and he's more the dispatch guy. I just get dispatched. So I know a little bit about it, but you call 911 and it generates a call. They start going through EMD, emergency medical dispatching, taking the notes. That's where, if you watch TV, like, okay, they're talking to them like, okay, start CPR, giving them instructions or getting addresses, which is kind of a misnomer, because if you call from anywhere, we can pretty much pick up your location. And then now, once that call's in there, sure, CONFIRE can see it, CAL FIRE can see it, Ontario can see it, that the ambulance provider should be able to see it. We should be able to see where the ambulances are at, and it's all seamless now, so everybody knows what's happening all at the same time. And that goes into, we don't just guess and throw well, that area always handles this call. We use software to say this engine's going to be closer to this call, this ambulance is going to be closer to this call. It takes all the guesswork out of people doing it. The computer does it for you.
So CAD to CAD is, our system is communicating with your system, so we all see where all of the resources are.
Absolutely, and that's big. I mean, you'd think that would have happened decades ago, but that just came to fruition this year.
Yeah, that's state of the art now.
Absolutely.
Right. No, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about what the provision of EMS services will look like to the member government agencies of CONFIRE, like the City of Yucaipa. And I'd like to approach this from the experience of the resident who is accessing the services, and also from the point of view of the member agencies. What does that look like logistically? What does it look like in terms of finances? So you're a resident, you're having a medical emergency, you call 911. What happens next? Where does that call go? What are the steps that happen under CONFIRE?
Yeah, so I think it's important for the community members to know that when you dial 911 initially, it actually goes to the law enforcement agency. So here in the city of Yucaipa, it's going to go to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, and it's going to go to their dispatch center. And they're going to determine, and they're going to ask you for an address and a phone number. And once you get that information, they're going to ask you what's going on. Do you have a police issue? Do you have a fire issue or a medical issue? If it's medical or fire related, then they're going to transfer you over to CAL FIRE. And so in that case, CAL FIRE is going to take the call. They're going to get the information. And another piece that Chief Malinowski mentioned, and both CONFIRE and CAL FIRE have this, and Ontario Fire, we have emergency medical dispatchers. So I like to call them the first responders. And so why that's important is that these folks are trained medically to start life-saving intervention long before a fire engine or a paramedic is even dispatched. And obviously, if we can stop the bleeding early, if we can get CPR going, the chances of survival increase drastically, right? So they're getting that information and they're providing that service immediately over at CAL FIRE. And so the dispatch center is asking for the information. While they're talking to the caller, simultaneously, their CAD, the computer-aided dispatch, is identifying who the closest resource, ALS resource is, that fire engine, where they're at in the city of Yucaipa. They're going to be the closest, most appropriate unit, and they're going to get them dispatched and started. The way it currently works today is then CAL FIRE would notify AMR and tell them we have a medical aid at 1234 Main Street. Here's what's going on. Here's the complaint. And then AMR would determine who their closest ambulance would be a most appropriate unit, and they would dispatch them. Well, you can tell there's going to be a delay in that, right? And so with CONFIRE and CAL FIRE together and Yucaipa, everyone working together with that CAD to CAD relationship, it's automatic. And so when CAL FIRE picks up that call and they're talking to that resident in Yucaipa and they're getting that information, it's immediately being fed over to CONFIRE. And then that ambulance, the most appropriate closest ambulance in the CAD, we will see where that ambulance is along with the Yucaipa Fire ambulance, that ALS unit, engine that's going to that call as well. And they'll go in tandem. And so we expect to cut down anywhere from a minute to a minute and 30 seconds of reflex time, which is critically important, especially if you're having a heart attack or you're not breathing, right? And so American Heart will tell you for every 60 seconds, 1 minute, with no CPR, your chances of survival go down by 10%. So that's a big, big deal when you're talking about seconds matter, right? So just cutting that down alone. And then we can see the entire operational area picture. So not every call needs to have a paramedic, lights and sirens, code 3 with an ambulance and a fire engine, right? And so we're able to triage that call, and we call it acuity. How severe is this patient? And we're going to get those really severe patients, we're going to get those units to them quick, and we're going to get them there efficiently and effectively. Well, if there's a lower acuity call, we might be able to triage or peel off another unit that can go to that call when there's a higher acuity call going down the street. Today, as it stands, we don't have that capability because we don't know where the ambulances are and we're not talking.
Right. So, Chief Malinowski, a lot of times people ask, I called 911. I'm having a medical emergency. Why did a fire engine show up? Right. Why are we set up the way we are? Why isn't it fire departments just fight fires? And when someone has a medical emergency, then an ambulance shows up, or something that's called a squad, right, which is essentially a small medical unit. A lot of people don't understand why. And in California, it's a very common model. I can tell you in many other states, it's not. I went on a trip up the entire East Coast a few years ago, and it's very common in some of those towns to have volunteer fire departments, and all they do is fight fires. And by the way, they have beautiful facilities because they have no staffing costs, right? But why aren't we set up that way? Why is the model the way it is in California?
So we were, and if you look at all fire departments, they were funded by essentially property tax, and a lot of departments have gone to this multi-tiered funding depending on what they wanted. So, but it's kind of like comparing, famous athletes, like, oh, how would Babe Ruth do versus Jose Canseco, whatever. And when we look at that, we're not comparing the eras. So yeah, we used to provide fire service, but if you look at now, if you had an out-of-hospital cardiac event, you were 99.9% going to die 80 years ago. Once we had the invention of paramedics providing pre-hospital life support, now we look at what do we want for essential services. Chief Cooke talked about it earlier. So what essential services do we want? So yeah, we could have the ambulance provide EMS, we could have the fire department provide just fires, cut staff, cut funding, but what services do we want? So we talked about it earlier, for every minute delay is a 10% decrease in survivability.
For a heart attack?
For critical incidences.
Okay.
So significant cardiac events, which is a good bulk of critical calls we run on. And the other component of that is staffing. So when we do EMD, we talked about there's different levels. So those top 2 levels, Delta and Echo, you should have 2 paramedics on scene and 2 paramedics transporting, which the ambulance doesn't provide. So the county will provide, regardless of who it is, it's going to be a single ambulance one EMT's got to drive, one paramedic. They're not going to be able to be efficient on critical care calls. They also are going to be held to a 10-minute standard. So when we're saying every minute is a decreased 10% survivability, where do we draw the line? Do we want that 5-minute fire department response where in the first 5 minutes it's kind of a wash? It's that 10% starts after the 5-minute mark, if you look at it, because your body can kind of maintain status quo for 5 minutes, and then we start going down. So where do we want to draw the line? You know, in our city, I don't want you to have a 0% decreased chance of survivability. I'm not comfortable with the 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. So the role of the fire department and the associated costs has changed, where we've gone from just fires to now we're doing EMS, like you said, is the bulk of our calls. We're cutting people out of cars. We're going to hazardous materials incidents. We're going to rescues, trench rescues, especially here. We have a lot of people who enjoy the open space in Yucaipa. We do a lot of remote area rescues. All stuff that requires equipment, requires training, requires appropriate staffing. Wildfires, we get a wildfire or two around us, and there's a lot that goes into that. Resource management, have a lot of fuels projects coming up where we're doing hazard fuel reduction, reforestation. They cause, massive debris flows, which we've dealt with, and we have to clean those up on the city side, increase our infrastructure, decrease and get rid of all the debris flow that's already socked in our basins, torn apart the Wilson 3 basin, and get ready for the next one. And that brings in, new invasive species, which we need to cut out before they create another wildfire threat. So the fire department's role has changed. And what do we want in our city? I know what I want. I live in this city, you live in this city, and I want when you call 911, we get paramedics in a very, very timely manner where they will make a definitive and life-saving outcome.
With this shift in the provision of fire and EMS services, and with the really exponential increase in the percentage of calls that fire departments go on that are medical calls, is there a movement away from sending a huge apparatus, a fire engine or sometimes even a ladder truck to a medical call, and instead looking at some kind of a smaller unit response, a squad or something in an SUV or a small truck, so that you're not bringing out the big fire engine every time someone has a minor medical or even a major medical issue. But a lot of the calls, I'm sure, are not heart attacks either. A lot of them are kind of more minor medical calls, and every time that fire engine is rolling out to that call, and that's a lot of fuel, that's a lot of mileage on a very expensive piece of equipment. Are you sensing a shift in the industry towards other service delivery models?
Absolutely. So we need to keep costs commensurate with the risk, but you also have to have like a base staffing. So we have to look at standards of coverage. What do we need for critical incidents, workforce deployment, even critical incidents for EMS calls? How many rescuers? We talked about that Delta Echo, the 2 life-threatening calls. We need 3 to 5 rescuers there. So you do need fire engines. We run about 70% medical aids, and then about 30% either a combination of non-medical or like a traffic collision. You got to cut somebody out of a car, but you still have to provide paramedic service. Right. But you need those appropriate tools. A car may be on fire. So if we run out there with a pickup truck, it's going to be a really bad day for them. We can save their lives. We just can't get them out of the car, put the fire out.
Right.
So absolutely. And that's where if you look at our strategic guide, which I know you're well aware of, that would be our next model, would be a squad. So instead of having a 3-person engine, it would be a 2-person squad, which really fills that need. We need a mission-focused EMS response. So that would, yes, instead of building another fire station, another fire engine, throwing spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, we look at, what do we run, what would be the most effective, and what would be the most fiscally responsible to meet that need, and it would be a squad. So sure, every fire chief, I'm sure, would love to see more fire engines, trucks, wazoos, helicopters, but yeah, absolutely a squad would be the best thing we could do in our city to increase patient survivability and decrease response times.
I don't know that I can promise you a helicopter, but the squad is something I think we really should work on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to bring it, home, a number of other agencies across the county have already used that deployment model. Chino Valley, we currently do that. Rancho just started a squad program for this piece, and so that's going to be, the wave of the future as well. But to dovetail on that, then let's also be efficient with our resources. And so these low acuity calls that we're talking about, maybe we can hold back the fire response. You know, if somebody's been sick for a week and they absolutely have no other way to get to the hospital and it has to be via an ambulance, well, maybe we can change that response and we can hold back the fire units. Well, we can only do that if we know where the ambulances are and how many we have and that we're adequately staffed. And so in the current configuration, that's not possible to do. In the future of county EMS and CONFIRE and working together, that's absolutely possible, and we're going to make that happen.
Fantastic.
And that's the headache right now too, is we have the ability, we don't have the resources. So we can turn that on tonight. We can turn that on. Same thing, if we get a squad, yes, why send an engine if the squad is just as close? So CAD can pull that more appropriate unit type first and reduce the engine rolling, but you do need both.
And speaking of quick responses, I am very excited that we're going to have a CONFIRE station here in the city of Yucaipa. That was important to us, and you know our staff and the CONFIRE staff worked together to make sure that would happen. We've identified a city-owned building in the city of Yucaipa where ultimately CONFIRE will have a station. In the meantime, people are seeing those ambulances starting to park at the building that used to be our incubator center. That's a temporary situation until the longer term solution is available early next year. But I mean that's a huge win for residents of the city of Yucaipa to know that we're going to have that resource right here in our city.
Yeah, and we're super excited. We're so thankful to the city for that partnership. And, you know, we know that what we would affectionately call Yucaipa and even Chino Hills on the west end of the county is bookends of the county, right? And so this is a hard to serve geographic area, right? Because you don't have resources coming in from Riverside County. They're all coming in from San Bernardino County. And so by having that dedicated resource, 24-hour unit, as we would call it, here in the city is going to be critically important. And then be able to backfill them with other ambulances that come in when that ambulance is on a call, to have that place for those folks to go is going to be critically important to make sure that we're staffed accordingly and that we have that appropriate resource there for that type of call.
Right. That's huge. Another question we get a lot has to do with finances. So you may be aware that the city of Yucaipa has been running a deficit. We have a structural deficit within our budget. It's something that we've been working on fixing. The voters of Yucaipa did pass Measure S, which is a 1% sales tax measure on the November ballot, so that'll be a huge help. What are the financial implications for cities who are members of CONFIRE, specifically for the city of Yucaipa? Is this, what kind of a financial commitment is it, and is there a potential revenue there as well?
Yeah, I think, early on, just like any other agency of part of a JPA, there is an initial, what we would call a buy-in or, a contract fee for the city of Yucaipa to join, and it was nominal. And that was really to have a buy-in and, for the risk that we were taking on as a collective joint powers authority. And so that's been solidified by the city of Yucaipa. And moving forward, and we had mentioned it before, is the revenue that's generated from ambulance transports can be significant. We can now do some innovative things that are out there. So we can do community paramedicine. We can do things that we haven't been able to provide in the past. So another thing that we offer at CONFIRE is our emergency communication nurse system. And so we have registered nurses embedded in our 911 dispatch center. So in the event that you call 911 and it's a low acuity, so it's a lower threshold call, it's not a life-threatening call, somebody may be sick, for a week. COVID was a big deal. And so instead of flooding these emergency rooms with patients that didn't need to be seen right away, we can transfer the caller to a nurse. And the registered nurse, it's a nurse hotline in effect for 911, can triage the call and get them the help they need without having to send a 911, ALS, fire department, and ambulance response. That's important, and so that we can hold back those fire units for the fire protection and fire threat that's out there. And then, of course, the advanced life support high acuity calls. And so we're doing those types of things to expand that program so the city of Yucaipa will have access to that. Your residents, when they call 911, if it's low acuity, we're going to have them go talk to our nurse and get them help other means. So that's what those revenues will go towards, stuff like that.
Well, if you look at the motivators too, you're going to get a different product when you have a 4-patient care model and when you have a model that has to produce a profit. When you're a for-profit model, you're geared towards making a profit for stakeholders versus what's our mission.
Right, which brings up another interesting point. Profit versus JPA, which is essentially government, right? Some of the questions we've received have been along the lines of, well, are these going to be now public employees that have pensions, and are your costs going to end up being much higher than the private sector running this? And speaking of private sector, CONFIRE is working with a private sector partner, Priority Ambulance. So maybe let's talk about that side of this a little bit. How does that work?
So the county sets the reimbursement rate. So going into this, everybody knows what the reimbursement is initially. And yeah, we'd be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. So if we can do it for less, we do it for less, and the county can adjust those rates. So there was no differently set rates for the provider. You're bidding on basically a known quantity, and can we do it? What's the feasibility? Can the fire service with a public-private partnership do it? And that's where, yes, if we went full fire model, it would be too expensive. We need that partner who can provide maybe that just EMS focus. They don't have the all risk staff like we do, but is essential for other reasons we talked about. So yes.
And what CONFIRE had to do, just because we are a governmental agency, is we had to go out for a competitive bid as well when we wanted to find a private partner that would be in this with us. So, excuse me, we opened that up, and ultimately Priority Ambulance, they're based out of Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. They came on station and showed us what they were able to bring to the table, and we were thrilled. That's been their model throughout the U.S., that they do public-private partnerships throughout the United States. And right now, I believe they're the second or third largest ambulance company in the nation. So they've been around. They know what they're doing. And so they haven't been in California. And so folks haven't seen them here regionally quite yet. And so we're super excited about them bringing what they have been able to provide across the United States here to California in that public-private partnership model. And so, the economies of scale, we just keep mentioning over and over again, is that, when you have this partnership, you get to take the economies of scale of what government brings to the table, with our staging locations, with the fire stations strategically located through our communities. And then we get to be able to partner that and couple it with the private industry, which they do really well in a lot of aspects, right? And so it's competitive. And so we want this to be a competitive market. And so what they bring to the table. And what's fascinating with CONFIRE compared to, maybe some other providers that have been out there, because of this model, we call it a unit hour cost, is actually significantly lower in a public-private partnership model than just a private model.
Really?
And so we've been able to prove that, and we get that same reaction. Well, how could that be? Because government is so expensive, right? Well, when you use the economies of scale, when you have a dispatch center that is already operational as the operational area coordinator, and you coordinate all these efforts together, you can actually cut down on a lot of waste, and you can cut down. So the current provider has to have their own dispatch center. They have to have their own mechanics. They have to have fleet service, right? There's all these things that they have to provide, HR, fiscal. Well, when you're doing that collectively as a JPA with all of these agencies involved, you get to cut down that cost, which then helps everybody out. So it actually ends up being cheaper to provide that service. And I think that's another reason why the county selected CONFIRE, frankly, is to go, hey, we can actually do it in a better economies of scale because we bring the bearer and the weight of all of these agencies together.
So will the paramedics who arrive in the ambulances be private employees of Priority Ambulance, or will they be government employees of CONFIRE?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we're thrilled to announce, and we're so thankful that the Board of Supervisors put in our RFP that we are required to hire the incumbent workforce. So I want to make sure that everyone hears that loud and clear. At the incumbent provider, AMR, we have already onboarded all of their employees in a part-time status. There was over 800 of them
That's
to come
huge.
over and be prepared. And so we're taking them on. Priority Ambulance is the one that they will work for. So they will not work for a government, so there's a lot of concerns about retirements and all those things. So it lowers the burdens to the cities as far as unfunded liability and those types of things. And so they'll continue to work on the private side. They'll work for Priority Ambulance. They'll be Priority Ambulance employees. But the big thing here, again, economies of scale. Well, now we get to look at these employees. This becomes our recruitment pool, right? So CALFIRE, Yucaipa, they get to look at all these folks and go, these are the folks already working in our communities and they're doing a great job. We're going to slide them over and let them become firefighter paramedics and do that all risk model. And so we get a free crack at them, if you will, to be able to see how they would integrate into our communities. And so we don't have that currently because there's such a silo. So, but yes, just to clarify, those employees will be working for Priority. On the communication side, the dispatch and all of that's going to be done by the fire agencies, CONFIRE, CALFIRE, the City of Ontario will continue to provide those services. But the folks, the boots on the street will be priority employees, and it will be the AMBAR, incumbent workforce. So nobody's losing their jobs. They're still here, staying in their communities. And so we're thankful again to the board for recognizing and making that a mandate. That's something we wanted to do anyways.
So Chief, we're talking about not enough paramedics on the streets right now. We're getting BLS ambulances still every day countywide. Can you speak to the hiring and where we're at with the CONFIRE staff as far as paramedic and EMT applications?
Yeah, right, wrong, or indifferent, we have 150% of the workforce we need.
Wow.
And so once we brought on the incumbent provider and all those employees, of course, we opened it up to the outside. And so we landed with 150% of what we need. And so that's a great place. And so
It's incredible.
Yeah, you hear a lot about staffing shortages, and I'm sure in certain places there may be that. We haven't quite experienced it yet.
Why do you think that is? Because all we've been hearing for at least the last 4 or 5 years is we can't hire enough paramedics. We can't find them. There are not enough people who want to do that job. And yet you've been able to hire 150% of the staff you need day one. What accounts for that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. Certainly, one of the things that Priority Ambulance and CONFIRE did immediately is we went out into the community and we started our own programs. And we started with the EMT level. And so we went into our communities because we weren't sure, were the incumbent workforce, did they want to come work for CONFIRE? We don't know. The incumbent provider, they're big, they can go transfer to other regions, and that's been offered to them. And so we weren't quite sure. And so to make sure that we had that intact, we actually started our own EMT programs, and we actually pulled members from our community and we sponsored them and we sent them to EMT school. And so I think that was kind of the catalyst of that. And then I think, people are excited about what's going on with CONFIRE. And, I think we've had folks from, throughout different regions that have applied here that are paramedics outside of this county. That are looking to see what we're doing here. And I think there's an excitement around this public-private partnership concept. And so if you're thinking about going into public safety, or you're going to get into the hospital healthcare industry, getting into this model that's so unique, that's really unlike any other in the state of California right now. We're the only public-private partnership model of this size and magnitude where we're bringing 15 agencies together. There's something special about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So how many employees will there be of CONFIRE itself, government employees who are employed by the JPA?
Yeah, so when it comes to CONFIRE itself, we're staying with the current configuration. We've had to upsize the organization a little bit. And so all told, you're going to have about 100 employees at max that will be CONFIRE employees. 90% of them are the dispatchers. We already have on station. They're already providing that service. And then we'll obviously bring in some folks to help us with the HR and the finance side, but all told about 100 employees. And so it's not going to be significant compared to about 1,100 employees in total that we'll have in the system. About 100 will be CONFIRE employees. And again, a majority of them are already here, and they were already with CONFIRE prior to doing this.
Okay. Speaking of CONFIRE employees, you have kind of an interesting background, right? You came to CONFIRE from Chino Valley Fire District, where you're deputy chief and still are, right? So you're, I guess, more or less on loan to CONFIRE now. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think, again, economies of scale, I'll just keep saying it, so here again, there was a need and there was an issue. And so CONFIRE was able to look across the broad scope of the 15 agencies and say, hey, there's a need here for this particular, position. Who do we have? And, fortunately, and I'm thrilled to be a part of that. I was selected to do that. And they told me 90 days, by the way, and it's been about 2.5 years, but it's been critically important that we all work together. And so this is that economies of scale that we're talking about, that we can plug and play and move people in and out. One of the things we're going through right now is, we haven't talked about it yet, but, the court spoke. There was a lawsuit that was filed in this particular case. And so there's an injunction in place, which is keeping us from providing the service right now. We were slated to go live on October 1st. So in the meantime, we have all these employees that have been hired by Priority Ambulance, and there's no revenue coming in to pay these employees. What do we do with them, right? And so CONFIRE now is acting as a temp agency, and we're able to loan these priority employees out to these different cities and agencies to provide services while we're in this waiting period. And so again, economies of scale. So we've got mechanics that are now working for the county of San Bernardino that are working on fire engines there. We've got EMTs that are working in different places, HR generalists. It's been quite fun to watch that, that these agencies are stepping forward, as a part of CONFIRE to provide that service.
That was a very smart and creative solution what CONFIRE is going to do with all these employees that have been hired and now, not quite ready to put into the field. But it's also great for all of the other agencies around the county because there is such a need for paramedics countywide at all the different agencies. So that's a fantastic solution. Let's talk about the rollout of CONFIRE and what the plans are moving forward. So, you mentioned the injunction. That was probably to be expected. The company that's had the contract for 40 years, AMR, you have to expect they're going to fight. There's an awful lot of money at stake, right? But assuming that resolves the way I think we all believe it will, you were slated to start. CONFIRE was slated to start October 1st of this year. At some point, you'll have the green light to go. What does that implementation look like once that green light is given?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to work together and collaborate with all of our agencies in our cities. We're so thrilled and thankful to the county for their continued support through this process. Obviously, we're in a joint, battle here, if you will, for this contract because we know what's at stake, and that's really, the service that we're providing out there and to improve that service. And so we are prepared. I know there's a lot of talk about those ambulances sitting there, right, wrong, or indifferent. Those ambulances won't be there permanently. This is a staging area for us, if you will, because these ambulances aren't providing service. Our partner Priority Ambulance has dropped $40 million to date on this project just to get these ambulances stood up and get the infrastructure in place. And so they're there. They're going to remain there and on station, and we're going to be prepared at a moment's notice when this gets resolved and that we can start the service to start providing it right away. And so we're looking forward to that day to change the landscape of EMS in the county as we know it.
Well, Yucaipa residents will probably be happy to know that the director of CONFIRE is not unfamiliar with this area. You were at one time the fire chief in the city of Redlands, our neighbor.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I, attended Crafton Hills College, went to the fire academy, went to EMT and paramedic, here as well. And so very fond of this community. And I just want to give you a shout out and to the chief here for all that you guys are doing in this community. The progress that you're making here in Yucaipa, everyone's noticing. And so keep up the great work. And we're thrilled to be a partner with this city of Yucaipa moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. Yucaipa residents really understand and always remind us here that the number one priority of local government is public safety, and ambulance service certainly is a critical component of public safety. So we really appreciate you guys being here. Chief Cooke, Chief Malinowski, thank you so much for coming on today. Episode number 7 will drop in 2 weeks on Tuesday, December 3rd. And until then, we hope everyone has a very happy Thanksgiving. And thank you all for watching and listening to Yucaipa 360.